Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Myers, and this is my Capstone project. I decided to do my research on Depop, which is a thrifting app, to analyze its cultural, political, and social impacts on each of us as a society. So let's get into it. So this presentation will look pretty much like my paper did. It'll include an intro, literature review, main body, findings and outcomes, summary, and a conclusion. This is exactly how I set up my paper. So to begin, it's important to shed light on what Depop is as an app and what it affords its users. So Depop is a buying and selling app for thrift shopping, and it has garnered mass attention from Gen Z and millennials alike through the comeback of vintage. A Depop shopper is not just an average consumer. He or she values style, distinctness, and independence. A Depop user may feel that they have an edge over normal shoppers in that they're practicing a more sustainable way of consumerism. My paper aims to answer the following questions. What does it mean to be a cool girl influencer in the digital age of thrift shopping? How do outside factors such as pop culture, the media, music, television, movies, and art influence fashion choices and trends? What role do influencers play in the popularization and growth of Depop? How does Depop perpetuate toxic consumption practices, gentrification, and body dysmorphia? And what are the practices a Depop seller undergoes in order to curate a do-it-yourself brand from the ground up? So it's critical to understand what the pre-existing literature says about Depop and how it answers these questions. Also, applying communication theory to the study was a seemingly easy feat in that it encompassed many ideas I've already studied throughout my time in the MCM program. So I broke up this literature review portion into three sections: self-presentation and expression in virtual spaces, the gentrification of thrifting in Depop, and influencer marketing and DIY branding. So firstly, for self-presentation in virtual spaces, Goffman's theory of the self truly takes precedence in studying Depop. Goffman posits that humans have two versions of who they are: the self and the character that they perform. On Depop, sellers are performing their best selves, which might not always be their most authentic selves, in order to establish their brands and maintain a high follower count. Multiple researchers such as Jens, Richard, Xiao and Jilly, and Hebbage all comment on the role of art in shaping our identities, especially music, and how it shapes the fashion sense and style of many of us. Walther also underscores this editability and asynchronous nature of digital media, making it easier to be well-liked on social media versus in person because we are able to sort of edit who we want to be, which applies to Depop in that people genuinely craft the images that they wish to embody online. And finally, Yao and Reich shed light on this idea of audiences and imagined audiences, in that we post online with a specific audience in mind in order to shape a more positive identity for ourselves. Next, on to gentrification of thrifting in Depop. Bither comments that the romanticization of thrift shopping stemmed from popular culture. I don't know if you remember Macklemore's song in 2012 called Thrift Shop, but that actually had a huge role in shaping popular culture and the normalization of thrifting. Influencers are especially normalizing the idea of thrifting, except it might actually be harmful to underprivileged communities. McSherry utilizes this idea of white environmentalism, where white influencers believe they are helping the environment by thrifting secondhand, when they're actually taking away necessary resources from these communities. Cross says that you must be mindful when you're thrifting. Only buy what you need and don't upcharge clothing items in order to make a profit. And finally, and this is something I was especially interested in reading about, Milligan says that the point of alternative subcultures in the first place was to rebel against the affluent and the powerful. But now the affluent and the powerful are creating a new alternative through Depop, which is actually sort of a hypocrisy of Depop that we might not be realizing is actually happening. So under this umbrella of influencer marketing and DIY branding, it was so interesting to read about the rise of influencers and their role in persuading Gen Z. Gen Z has different advertising needs than previous generations in that we don't really fall for the typical traditional ad. We like to hear influencers talk about it. Word of mouth marketing is especially fascinating in that instead of following brands, Gen Z tends to follow influencers on Instagram to garner a vision for an outfit, and then they go and take to Depop to find those garments. Influencers play a huge role in the romanticization of thrift shopping, which I've already mentioned, and their followers will buy into it too. London boasts that Depop has called for a generation of bedroom entrepreneurs who are selling their own clothing out of their own closets in order to make money. And anyone can truly become a successful Depop seller if they devote enough time and energy to it, which is so interesting. Like, this is a way for everyone to get involved in Depop and making a profit. And finally, Chung and Cho reiterate that in order to build trust with an audience as an influencer must be authentic and transparent with their followers. And when influencers talk about their positive experiences using Depop, their audiences tend to follow suit and check out the app themselves. So let's move on to the main body of my paper. We're going to discuss the cultural impacts, political ramifications, and social influence of Depop. So as for cultural impacts, Depop has brought out this idea of aesthetics and styles that have been previously popularized through pop culture and are now making a comeback on society. Examples here may include mall goth and Y2K trends that took over the early 2000s in its own craze. Depop users tend to look into the past with rose-tinted glasses, thinking that this time before them was better and more exciting, had better fashion trends, etc., which is a testament to this fixation on nostalgia of Depop. Now, this woman in this photo right here is iGirl. She's an influencer that has been quite a catalyst in reigniting and reinvigorating vintage styles in the modern day. She goes by iGirl, and she actually gives her followers this option to buy a bundle from her shop. The bundles range from $100 to $200, and it's actually a really unique way to collect pieces from a specific time period requested by a buyer. For instance, you can ask iGirl to make your bundle reminiscent of the movie Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and then you tell her your star sign, and she'll customize a couple outfits for you, including shoes that fit the very description that you sent her. This allowed Bella to garner a huge audience, many fans through Depop, which is so interesting. As far as political ramifications go, there are three main ones that I found in my research. First, and as we previously spoke about in the literature review, Depop may perpetuate gentrification and the taking of resources from underprivileged minority communities that need it the most. Second, there is a major lack of representation on the Depop executive team, actually, believe it or not. 0% of Depop's executive team are Black, and many Depop sellers are white, which prolongs this Eurocentric beauty standard that we're sort of trying to get away from. And finally, and even perhaps unintentionally, Depop sellers may be making users self-conscious or fall into bouts of body dysmorphia because of the lack of representation in sizes of many models on Depop. So lastly, let's talk about social influence. As previously mentioned, Depop is full of DIY bedroom entrepreneurs that are able to make a space or a brand for themselves online, which may be considered a positive aspect of the app. I'd say so. However, lots of time and energy may go into crafting one's brand, and editing or posting listings is a difficult job, as I've heard from a Depop seller I interviewed, Gabby LaRocca, which we'll get to in a bit. And finally, Depop has garnered mass attention on other social media platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram, which shows this app-to-app popularity. You can't really escape Depop even if you're on other social media platforms. And I wanted to sort of show this example of a well-known influencer, Lindsay Rem, who made many videos. This is just one of them, showing off her new items from Depop in a haul. And she has a lot of followers who actually take to Depop themselves after seeing her posting about her adventures on Depop. Now we're going to move on to the findings and outcomes. I have some interesting ones that I've discovered through a personal interview with Depop seller Gabby LaRocca, and also through an analysis of testimonial tweets of Depop critics. So on March 15th, I was able to interview Gabby LaRocca, who's a Depop seller under the alias Gabby Cat Collective, about building her brand through a do-it-yourself ethos and from the ground up with her overall experiences working as a reseller through Depop. To date, she has over 500 sales and almost 7,000 followers. And among many questions, I asked her about the controversy of selling on Depop, and LaRocca responded, quote, "There's a stigma against reselling. There's this misconception that thrift stores are only for people who are poor, but thrifting is for everyone. Giving money to Goodwill goes into funding the system itself. Though some concerns are valid. Buying a cheap shirt and selling it for $80 is lame, unless the piece is really worth that much. Honestly, though, only a couple people really do that. Most resellers don't do that." I really appreciated hearing LaRocca's perspective on this, as she shed light on something that I didn't personally read much about in the research I had done. A lot of the research was a critique of the gentrification of Depop, whereas Gabby's point of view sort of underscores that it's actually not happening as much as we may think it is. I also wanted to highlight some tweets of people critiquing Depop, and I found this one that highlights the issue of gentrification that Gabby spoke on earlier. So this Twitter user says, "Depop sellers who buy a shirt at Goodwill that's from 2006 for $3 and proceed to sell it as Y2K vintage for $40. Trust you will be dealt with." So this is a problem that is plaguing a lot of people on Depop from their own personal experiences. And that's why it was really interesting for me to hear an actual Depop seller's perspective on this. And she kind of said, like, this doesn't really happen as often as it might be portrayed in the media or through research. So very interesting. And then my next slide is just, I put together a list of common practices that Depop sellers take on in order to create a successful shop. This is compiled from research, personal opinion, and my interview with Gabby. So these 4 practices can help to garner an audience to one's page. Modeling the clothing, having an eye-catching background, using aesthetically pleasing edits, and writing detailed captions and hashtags can all sort of do the trick in making your shop seem trustworthy and getting it to have more of a popularity stance. So in summation, Depop affords its buyers and sellers an unconventional way to thrift, shop, and resell items of clothing from decades prior to our own. Depop has changed the fundamental ways in which we shop by making thrifting an even more accessible practice virtually, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people, instead of going to Goodwill or going to other thrift stores, they're just going on their phones and buying their own unique clothing through Depop. Ultimately, with Depop, users can customize their entire wardrobe with pre-loved pieces that are one of a kind. However, buyer beware. Let's be sure to stay conscious about our choices to use Depop, or we may be contributing to the overarching evils of consumption. So intent is truly everything. That is my capstone research. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you learned a thing or two about Depop and consumption, gentrification, and all of that interesting stuff. Thanks so much.